The 315 Union Pacific thundered across the Arizona desert, like a metal beast fleeing death itself. Inside the third passenger car, 6-year-old Emma Morrison pressed her small nose against the dusty window, her bright blue eyes wide with a mixture of fear and curiosity that she couldn't quite understand. Her tiny hands clutched a worn cloth bag containing everything she owned, 2 dresses, a pair of boots too big for her feet, and a beautiful turquoise necklace that seemed to glow with its own inner light. Emma had been riding trains for what felt like forever, passed from one family to another, like a package nobody really wanted to keep. The adults all smiled at her with the same sad expression, the one reserved for children who had no parents and no real home. But Emma was different from other orphans, though she couldn't explain why. Sometimes she remembered Strange Things songs in a language that sounded like wind through canyons, the smell of cedar smoke, gentle hands braiding her hair, while humming melodies that made her heart ache with longing. The train car was stuffy and hot, filled with the smell of unwashed bodies and stale tobacco. Emma tried to make herself smaller in her seat, hoping the other passengers wouldn't notice her. She had learned that being noticed usually meant being asked questions she couldn't answer or being told things about herself that didn't feel true. "Are you scared, little girl?" asked the woman sitting across from her, a plump lady with kind eyes and a motherly smile. Emma considered the question carefully. She was scared, but not of the things other children feared. She was scared of the dreams that came to her at night, filled with fire and shouting and people crying. She was scared of the strange feeling that she was supposed to be somewhere else, with someone else living a completely different life. A little, she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "Don't worry, dear. The McKenzies are good people. They'll take care of you." Emma nodded politely, but inside she felt the same hollow emptiness she always felt when adults talked about her future. The McKenzies were just another family she would live with temporarily, another set of strangers who would try to make her into someone she wasn't. What Emma didn't know was that at that very moment, 2 men were racing across the desert toward her train, both driven by pain and loss that had consumed their lives for 5 long years. One was hunting for justice, the other for redemption. And both were about to discover that the truth was far more complex than either of them had ever imagined. James Morrison, known throughout the territory as Iron Jack, rode hard at the head of a cavalry column, his weathered face set with the grim determination of a man who had finally found his prey. At 38, Morrison had the lean, dangerous look of someone who had spent years tracking killers through the worst country in the American West. His reputation as a bounty hunter was legendary. He never gave up, never missed a shot, and never let a criminal escape justice. But Morrison's pursuit of the Apache war chief Dakota wasn't about bounty money. It was about a debt that had been eating at his soul for 5 years. Ever since the massacre at Copper Creek had taken everything he cared about from him. His wife Margaret and his 3-year-old daughter Emma had been killed in what the newspapers called a brutal Apache raid, and Morrison had sworn on their graves that he would find the man responsible and make him pay. The tip had come from Colonel Bradley at Fort Huachuca, delivered in a coded telegram that Morrison had received just 3 days ago. Bradley's intelligence network had intercepted Apache communications suggesting that Dakota was planning to hit the 315 Union Pacific for its silver shipment. The information was reliable. Bradley had assured him coming from sources deep within the Apache community. What Morrison didn't know was that the intelligence was deliberately false part of a larger plan that would soon trap him in a web of lies and betrayal that reached to the highest levels of the territorial government. 50 miles ahead of Morrison's column, Dakota of the Chiricahua Apache waited in the shadow of Devil's Rock, his dark eyes studying the approaching train with the patience of a natural hunter. At 42, Dakota was one of the most wanted men in Arizona territory, blamed for raids that had left dozens of settlers dead and entire communities living in fear. But Dakota knew the truth: he had never attacked innocent people. The real raiders were white men painted to look like Apache warriors, and he had been trying to prove their innocence for years. Today's mission was different from his usual attempts to gather evidence. His scouts had reported that the 315 Union Pacific was carrying something far more valuable than silver government documents that could prove his people's innocence and end the cycle of violence that had torn his world apart. "The train comes soon," said his lieutenant, a young warrior named Nashoba, who had grown up hearing stories of the great chief's legendary battles. Dakota nodded, his weathered face painted with white clay and ochre in the traditional war pattern. "Remember, we want the mail car, not the passengers. No one dies unless they force our hand." The plan was simple and precise. They would derail the train, take the documents they needed, and disappear into the desert before the cavalry could respond. It was the kind of operation Dakota had carried out dozens of times before. But as he watched the black smoke rising from the approaching locomotive, he felt a strange sense of foreboding. The train rounded a bend between two towering red mesas, its whistle echoing off the canyon walls like a scream. Dakota's warriors emerged from behind the rocks with perfect timing, their war cries filling the air as they galloped alongside the speeding cars. The first stick of dynamite landed exactly where Dakota had aimed it, beneath the mail car, lifting it off the tracks in a shower of sparks and twisted metal. The passenger cars shuddered and swayed, but remained upright exactly as planned. Dakota's men moved with disciplined efficiency, searching through the wreckage of the mail car for the documents they needed. But as Dakota approached the third passenger car to ensure that no one had been seriously injured, he saw something that made his blood run cold. A small girl in a blue dress stood in the doorway of the overturned car, her blonde hair catching the sunlight, and her bright blue eyes staring at him without fear. Around her neck was a turquoise necklace that Dakota recognized immediately. It was identical to one that had belonged to his sister Mary Crow Feather, who had been taken by soldiers years ago and never seen again. "You," Dakota said in careful English, stepping closer to the train car. "Child, where did you get that necklace?" Emma looked down at the turquoise stones, her small fingers tracing their smooth surface. "The lady at the orphanage gave it to me. She said it belonged to my first mother before she died." "Your first mother?" Dakota's voice was barely above a whisper. "What do you remember about her?" Emma's eyes grew distant, as if she were looking at something very far away. "Sometimes I dream about her. She had long dark hair and brown eyes like yours. She used to sing to me in a language I don't understand, and she smelled like cedar and sage." Dakota felt the world shifting beneath his feet. The necklace, the child's description, the timing. It was all too much to be coincidence. Could this white girl be his sister's daughter? Could Mary Crow Feather have survived long enough to bear a child before her death? Before he could ask more questions, the thunder of approaching hoofbeats announced the arrival of Morrison's cavalry column. Iron Jack Morrison rode into view like an avenging angel, his rifle ready, and his face set with 5 years of accumulated rage and grief. But as Morrison's eyes fell on the small girl standing beside the Apache chief, his expression changed from fury to shock to something that looked like recognition. The girl was the right age, the right coloring, and there was something in her face that made his heart race with impossible hope. "Let the girl go, Apache." Morrison called out, his voice carrying across the desert. "She's got nothing to do with this." Dakota looked between Morrison and the child, his mind racing through the implications. "She has everything to do with this," he replied. "More than you could possibly understand." "What's your name, child?" Morrison asked, his weapon lowering slightly. Emma looked up at him with those bright blue eyes that reminded him so much of his lost daughter. "Emma Morrison, sir. I'm going to live with the McKenzies in Tucson." The words hit Morrison like a physical blow. Emma Morrison had been his daughter's name, but his Emma was dead, buried in the ruins of Copper Creek, This had to be some kind of cruel coincidence, a trick of fate that was tearing open wounds he had thought were healed. That's not possible. Morrison whispered, his voice barely audible. My Emma died 5 years ago. Did she? Dakota asked, his voice carrying a note of challenge. Or did you simply believe what you were told to believe? Emma looked between the two men, sensing that she was at the center of something she didn't understand. The turquoise necklace felt warm against her skin. And for a moment, she could almost remember a woman's voice singing a lullaby in that strange, beautiful language. I don't remember much about before the orphanage, she said quietly. But sometimes I dream about a man with kind eyes who called me by a different name. And sometimes I dream about fire and smoke and people crying. Morrison's face went pale. After the Copper Creek massacre, a child matching his daughter's description had been found wandering in the desert, delirious with fever and unable to remember her own name. The military doctor had said the trauma might have affected her memory, but with time and care, she might recover. Instead, she had been sent to an orphanage when no family members could be located. Morrison had been told she died of fever. But what if that had been a lie? The necklace. Morrison said, his voice thick with emotion. Tell me about the necklace. Emma's hand went to her throat. The lady at the orphanage said it was with me when they brought me there. She said I wouldn't let anyone take it off even when I was sick with fever. Dakota's eyes narrowed as he studied the ornate silver work and the particular shade of blue in the turquoise. That necklace was made by my sister. She was taken by soldiers forced to marry a white officer. She died bearing his child, but the child was never found. The pieces of the puzzle were beginning to fall into place. But the picture they formed was more complex than anyone had imagined. Emma wasn't just Morrison's lost daughter, she was also the child of an Apache woman who had been stolen from her people and forced into a life of captivity. We need to talk. Morrison said, his rifle forgotten. All of us. There's more to this story than any of us understand. But before anyone could respond, then the sound of approaching cavalry echoed across the desert. A full troop of soldiers was riding hard toward them, drawn by the smoke and the sound of the explosion. The moment of revelation was about to become a battlefield. There's shelter in the rocks, Dakota said, pointing toward a maze of red stone formations. We can figure this out without getting ourselves killed. Morrison looked at his own soldiers, then at Dakota, then at the girl who might be his daughter. For 5 years he had dreamed of this moment, the chance to face the man who had destroyed his family. But now, with Emma standing between them, everything had changed. Stand down, Morrison ordered his men. Let them go. Sir, Sergeant Hayes questioned, his voice filled with confusion. Are you sure about this? I've never been more sure of anything in my life, Morrison replied. That girl might be my daughter, and I'm going to find out the truth. The three of them rode toward the rocks as the main cavalry force approached, each lost in their own thoughts about what the truth might reveal. Emma sat behind Dakota on his horse, her small arms wrapped around his waist, feeling safer than she had in years. There was something about this Apache chief that reminded her of the kind man in her dreams, the one who had sung her lullabies and called her by a name she couldn't quite remember. As they reached the shelter of the stone formations, Emma made a decision that would change everything. I think I remember something else, she said quietly. I remember a song. Would you like to hear it? Without waiting for an answer, she began to hum a melody that was both beautiful and heartbreaking. It was an Apache lullaby, the kind that mothers sang to their children when the world was dark and uncertain. But it was also a song that Morrison recognized his wife had hummed it sometimes when she was putting their daughter to sleep. The melody hung in the air between them, a bridge across the chasm of race and hatred that had divided their worlds. In that moment, both men realized that the truth about Emma Morrison was going to be more complicated and more painful than either of them had imagined. Hidden in the maze of red rocks, the three unlikely companions prepared to uncover secrets that would shake the foundations of everything they believed about Justice Family and the price of truth in a world built on lies. The narrow canyon where they took shelter was like a natural cathedral, its red walls rising hundreds of feet toward a thin slice of blue sky. Emma sat on a flat rock between the two men, her small fingers still tracing the turquoise necklace as fragments of memory continued to surface. "The song," she said suddenly, her voice filled with wonder. "I remember who taught it to me. It was my first mother, the one with the gentle hands. She used to sing it when I was scared or couldn't sleep." Morrison felt his heart pounding. "Emma, what else do you remember about this woman?" The little girl closed her eyes, concentrating hard. She had long, dark hair that she wore in braids. Her eyes were brown and sad, like she was always thinking about something that made her cry. She wore a blue dress, but it was old and patched, and she had scars on her wrists like someone had tied her up. She was being held against her will. Dakota said grimly, "My sister was captured during a raid on our village. She was taken to a military post and forced to marry Colonel McKenzie." Morrison's blood ran cold. Colonel McKenzie was the same officer who had been providing him with intelligence about Apache movements. The same man who had sent him the tip about today's train robbery. "McKenzie told me my daughter was dead," Morrison said slowly. "He said she died of fever at the orphanage. But what if he lied? What if he's been lying about everything?" Emma opened her eyes, and both men could see the fear in them. "I remember the night everything changed. There was fire and shouting and men with painted faces. But they weren't really Apache, were they? They smelled different, and they talked like white men trying to sound like Indians." The revelation hit both men like a thunderbolt. The massacre at Copper Creek, the event that had started Morrison's 5-year quest for revenge, might not have been carried out by Apache warriors at all. "You're saying white men attacked Copper Creek?" Morrison asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Emma nodded. "I was hiding under a bed when they came. I saw their faces up close. The paint was all wrong, and one of them had blue eyes. Apache people don't have blue eyes." Dakota leaned forward intently. "What happened to your Apache mother that night?" "She tried to protect me," Emma said, tears beginning to stream down her face. "She hid me under the bed and told me not to make any noise no matter what I heard. Then the men came in and they hurt her. They killed her because she wouldn't tell them where the other children were hidden." Morrison felt sick to his stomach. For 5 years he had been hunting the wrong man, seeking revenge against an innocent Apache chief, while the real killers went free. "Emma, do you remember anything else about that night? Anything that might help us figure out who was really responsible?" The little girl was quiet for a long moment, her face scrunched up in concentration. "There was a man who seemed to be in charge. He didn't have paint on his face, and he wore a blue uniform with shiny buttons. He had a big mustache and mean eyes. He kept shouting orders at the other men." "A military officer," Morrison said, "leading a fake Apache raid." "Like Colonel McKenzie," Dakota added. "It has to be. He's the one who had access to your sister, the one who would have known about the children, the one who could have organized a false flag operation." The sound of approaching horses interrupted their conversation. Through gaps in the rocks, they could see dust clouds rising from multiple directions. The cavalry was surrounding them, and their time was running out. "We need to move," Morrison said, checking his rifle. "If McKenzie is behind this, he'll do whatever it takes to keep us from exposing the truth." But as they prepared to flee deeper into the canyon, Emma made a discovery that changed everything. Behind a fallen boulder, she found a leather satchel that had been hidden for years. Inside were documents that made Morrison's hands shake as he read them. "What is it?" Dakota asked, seeing the expression on Morrison's face. "Orders," Morrison said, his voice filled with horror. "Orders signed by Colonel McKenzie for special operations designed to look like Apache raids, payment receipts for irregular forces, and a list of settlements marked for pacification." Emma looked at the papers, her 6-year-old mind trying to understand their significance. "What does it mean?" "It means," Morrison said slowly, "that Colonel McKenzie has been staging fake Apache raids to justify the Indian Wars. He's been killing innocent people, both white and Apache, to keep the conflict going." "But why?" Emma asked. Dakota's face was grim. "Because war is profitable. As long as there's fighting, the army gets more money, more supplies, more power. McKenzie and his associates have been getting rich off the blood of innocent people." The documents revealed the full scope of the conspiracy. Military officers were financing fake Apache raids to justify increased funding for the Indian Wars. Settlers were being killed by their own people, and the Apache were being blamed to cover up the crimes. "Copper Creek is on the list," Morrison said, pointing to a particular entry. "Marked for elimination because the residents were asking too many questions about missing supply shipments." Emma's eyes widened with understanding. "My Apache mother knew about this, didn't she? That's why they killed her." Morrison nodded. "She was Mackenzie's source of information about Apache movements. When she learned he was using that information to stage fake raids, she became a threat. So they eliminated her," Dakota finished. "And they used her death to justify even more violence against my people." The sound of gunfire echoed off the canyon walls. The cavalry had found them, and the final confrontation was about to begin. But now they had something more valuable than weapons. They had proof of the conspiracy that had torn their worlds apart. "We have to get these documents to someone who can act on them," Morrison said. "Someone who can stop this madness." "Who?" Dakota asked. "McKenzie has connections throughout the territorial government. Who's going to believe an Apache chief and a bounty hunter?" Emma stood up, her small frame filled with determination. "They'll believe me," she said simply. "I'm the proof. I'm a white child who was raised by an Apache woman. I'm living evidence that the story they've been telling is a lie." Bullets began to ricochet off the canyon walls as the cavalry closed in. Morrison and Dakota returned fire, but they were outnumbered and running low on ammunition. Their only hope was to reach the other end of the canyon, where a narrow trail led up to the mesa top. "Can you climb?" Morrison asked Emma, pointing to the treacherous path. She nodded, her face set, with the same determination that had helped her survive 5 years of uncertainty and loss. "My first mother taught me. She said Apache children learn to climb before they learn to walk properly." They began their ascent as the cavalry entered the canyon behind them. The trail was barely wide enough for one person with loose rocks that could send them tumbling to their deaths. But Emma moved with the sure-footed grace of someone who had learned to navigate dangerous terrain, and she helped guide the 2 men up the cliff face. Halfway up, Morrison's strength began to fail. The emotional revelations of the day, combined with the physical exertion, were taking their toll. He slipped on a loose stone and nearly fell, saved only by Dakota's quick reflexes. "Leave me," Morrison gasped. "Take the documents and the girl. Get them to safety." "No," Emma said firmly, her voice carrying more authority than anyone expected from a 6-year-old. "We go together or not at all. That's what families do." The word family gave Morrison the strength he needed. With renewed determination, he continued the climb, following Emma and Dakota toward the mesa top and the promise of escape. They reached the summit just as the sun was setting, painting the desert in shades of gold and crimson. Behind them, the cavalry was still struggling up the narrow trail, but ahead lay miles of open mesa, perfect country for someone who knew how to read the land. There's an old mine about 10 miles north. Dakota said, studying the terrain. It's been abandoned for years, but it might provide shelter while we figure out our next move. They began to walk across the mesa, three unlikely companions, united by the truth that they carried. Emma walked between the two men, her small hand alternately holding Morrison's and Dakota's, as she listened to them plan their next move. "When this is over," Morrison said, looking down at the girl who had turned his world upside down, "what happens to you?" Emma was quiet for a long moment, her young mind grappling with questions that would challenge adults. "I don't know," she said finally. "I remember two mothers now, the one who gave birth to me and the one who raised me. I remember two fathers, you and the man who tried to protect me. I remember two names and two ways of seeing the world. That doesn't make you confused?" Dakota said gently. "It makes you special. You can be a bridge between our peoples if you choose to be." Emma looked up at the first stars appearing in the darkening sky. "I want to make sure no other children have to grow up not knowing who they are. I want to make sure the truth gets told, even if it's hard to hear." As they walked across the mesa under the star-filled sky, Emma began to understand that her story was bigger than just her own identity. She was living proof that the official version of events was a lie, and her testimony could save lives and prevent future tragedies. The abandoned mine appeared in the distance, its wooden framework silhouetted against the night sky. But as they approached, Emma felt a chill that had nothing to do with the desert night. "Something's wrong," she whispered, tugging on Morrison's sleeve. Morrison studied the mine entrance through his spyglass, and his face went pale. "She's right. There are men waiting inside. It's another trap." The mine shaft descended into darkness, like a throat waiting to swallow them whole. Emma could see the glint of rifle barrels in the shadows, and she counted at least 6 men positioned to ambush anyone who entered. "How did they know we would come here?" Morrison asked. "Because McKenzie knows this territory as well as we do," Dakota replied. "He's been planning this for a long time." Emma studied the mine entrance, her young mind working through the problem with the methodical approach that had kept her alive for 6 years. "There's another way in," she said suddenly. "Look at the slope of the hill. There has to be a ventilation shaft somewhere." She was right. They found the old air shaft about 100 yards from the main entrance, partially hidden by brush and fallen rocks. It was narrow and treacherous, but it offered a way to get inside without being seen. "I'll go first," Emma said. "I'm the smallest, and I can move quietly." "Absolutely not," Morrison said. "It's too dangerous." "Everything's dangerous now," Emma replied with a matter-of-fact tone that children use when stating obvious truths. "But I'm the only one who can fit through that shaft without making noise." Dakota looked at Morrison, and both men realized that the little girl was right. She was their best chance of getting inside undetected. "If you get into trouble, you run," Morrison said. "Don't try to be a hero." Emma smiled at him with the kind of fearless confidence that only children possess. "I won't be a hero. I'll just be me." She disappeared into the narrow shaft, leaving the two men to wait in the darkness above. The minutes stretched like hours as they listened for sounds of discovery or conflict. Finally, they heard Emma's voice echoing up from below. "It's safe," she called softly. "Come down, but be quiet." They lowered themselves through the shaft into the mine tunnel where Emma was waiting with a small oil lamp she had found. The light revealed a network of passages that honeycombed the hillside remnants of the silver boom that had brought thousands of prospectors to Arizona territory. "The men are all watching the main entrance," Emma whispered. "But I found something else. There's a room full of boxes, and some of them have military markings." She led them deeper into the mine, past abandoned equipment and collapsed tunnels, until they reached a chamber that had been converted into a storage depot. Wooden crates were stacked floor to ceiling, each one marked with government seals and shipping labels. Weapons, Morrison said, prying open one of the crates. Rifles, ammunition, dynamite, enough to equip a small army. Dakota examined the shipping labels. These are supposed to be going to Fort Huachuca, but they're being stored here instead. Mackenzie's private arsenal. Morrison concluded. He's been skimming military supplies and using them to equip his fake Apache raiders. Emma found another crate filled with something even more disturbing: Apache clothing and war paint, obviously manufactured rather than authentic. There were also detailed instructions for how to stage convincing Indian attacks, complete with scalping techniques and battlefield positioning. "This is how they've been fooling everyone," she said, holding up a fake Apache headdress. "They dress up like Indians and attack innocent people, then blame the real Apache for the violence." The scope of the conspiracy was becoming clear. McKenzie and his associates had been systematically manufacturing a war, profiting from the chaos, while innocent people on both sides paid the price in blood. "We need to get this evidence to the territorial capital," Morrison said. "The governor needs to see this." But before they could leave the mine, the sound of approaching footsteps echoed through the tunnels. Someone was coming, and they were trapped in the storage chamber with no way out. "They know we're here," Dakota said, checking his rifle. Emma looked around the chamber, her mind working quickly. "No, they don't. But they're going to search every tunnel until they find us." She pointed to a narrow passage that led deeper into the mine. "That way. It connects to the old Chinese tunnels." "How do you know that?" Morrison asked. "Because I can read," Emma said simply. "There's a map on the wall over there." She was right. A hand-drawn map showed the entire mine complex, including a series of tunnels that had been dug by Chinese workers during the early days of the silver boom. The tunnels connected to a separate entrance on the other side of the hill, far from where Mackenzie's men were waiting. They gathered the most important evidence and began the dangerous journey through the abandoned tunnels. The passages were narrow and unstable, with rotting timbers and loose rocks that could collapse at any moment. But Emma led the way with confidence, her small size allowing her to navigate spaces that would have trapped the men. "How are you so good at this?" Morrison asked as they crawled through a particularly tight section. "I've been hiding my whole life," Emma replied. "First from the bad memories, then from the people who wanted to change me into someone else. You learn to be small and quiet and invisible." Her words broke Morrison's heart. This little girl had been forced to grow up too fast, to develop survival skills that no child should need. But those same skills were now keeping them alive. They emerged from the Chinese tunnels into the pre-dawn darkness, miles from the mine entrance, where Mackenzie's men were still waiting. The documents and evidence were secure, but they still faced the challenge of getting to the territorial capital alive. "We need horses," Morrison said, looking at the vast expanse of desert that stretched before them. "And food and water," Dakota added. "It's 60 miles to Prescott, and Mackenzie will have men watching every road." Emma looked up at the stars, her young face thoughtful. "What about the mining town? Jerome is only 20 miles from here, and it's full of people who don't like the army very much." Morrison and Dakota exchanged glances. The little girl was right again. Jerome was a rough, independent community where questions weren't asked and authorities weren't welcome. It might be the perfect place to find help. "Jerome it is," Morrison said. "But we travel at night and stay hidden during the day. Mackenzie's men will be looking for us." As they began their trek across the desert, Emma felt a strange sense of peace. For the first time in her life, she knew exactly who she was and what she had to do. She was Emma Morrison, daughter of a bounty hunter and an Apache woman, and she was going to make sure the truth was told. The journey to Jerome took them through some of the most beautiful and dangerous country in Arizona. They traveled by night, following game trails and dry washes that would conceal their movement from pursuit. During the day, they sheltered in caves and abandoned prospectors' shacks, always listening for the sound of approaching horses. On the second night, Emma made another important discovery. Hidden in Morrison's saddlebags was a small journal where he had been recording his thoughts and observations during his 5-year hunt for Dakota. "You wrote about me," she said, reading by the light of a small fire. "You wrote about missing me and wondering if I was still alive." Morrison's face was filled with pain and regret. "I never stopped hoping. Even when they told me you were dead, part of me refused to believe it." Emma read more of the journal, her heart breaking, as she saw the depth of her father's grief and guilt. "You blamed yourself for not being there to protect me." "I was supposed to be your father," Morrison said. "I was supposed to keep you safe." "You couldn't have known what was going to happen," Emma said gently. "And you never stopped looking for me. That's what matters." Dakota watched the reunion between father and daughter with a mixture of joy and sorrow. He was happy that Emma had found her family, but he also knew that his own sister would never have the chance to see her daughter grow up. "Tell me about my Apache mother," Emma said to Dakota. "Tell me about Mary Crowfeather." Dakota's weathered face softened as he remembered his sister. "She was the bravest woman I ever knew. When the soldiers came to take her, she fought like a mountain lion. But she also knew when to bend, so she wouldn't break. She survived in captivity by keeping hope alive, by remembering who she was, no matter what they tried to make her become." "Is that why she made the necklace?" Emma asked, touching the turquoise stones. "She made 2 necklaces," Dakota said. "One for each of her daughters. They were meant to be reminders that no matter how far apart you were, you would always be connected." Emma's eyes widened. "2 daughters, I have a sister." Morrison and Dakota exchanged glances. They had been so focused on Emma's story that they hadn't considered the possibility of other children. "It's possible," Dakota said carefully. "Your Apache mother was held by McKenzie for almost 2 years. She could have had more than one child. But where is she?" Emma asked, her voice filled with excitement and hope. "Where is my sister?" "We don't know," Morrison admitted. "But if she exists, McKenzie would have kept her close. She might be at Fort Huachuca, or she might have been placed with another family." Emma's face set with determination. "Then we have to find her. We have to make sure she's safe. First, we have to get to Jerome," Morrison said. "Then we'll figure out how to find your sister." The mining town of Jerome clung to the mountainside like a collection of wooden boxes scattered by a giant's hand. Even at night, the stamp mills thundered, and the smelters glowed with orange fire, turning the mountain into a man-made volcano that never slept. Emma stared at the bustling town with wonder. She had never seen anything like it, a place where people from all over the world had come to dig silver and gold from the earth. The air was thick with smoke and the sound of different languages, and the streets were filled with men who looked like they had stepped out of adventure stories. "It's like a different world," she said, her voice filled with awe. "It is a different world," Morrison replied. "Jerome doesn't follow the same rules as the rest of the territory. People here make their own laws and solve their own problems." They made their way through the crowded streets, past saloons that never closed and gambling halls that ran games around the clock. The town was in the middle of its monthly mining festival, a celebration that brought together workers from all the nearby claims. "Perfect timing," Dakota observed. "With this many people around, we can blend in, and no one will notice 3 more strangers." They found lodging at a small boarding house run by a German immigrant named Klaus Müller, who asked no questions and accepted payment in silver coins. Emma was fascinated by the international character of the town. She heard German, Chinese, Spanish, and languages she couldn't identify spoken in the streets. Why are there so many different kinds of people here? she asked Muller as he showed them to their room. Because silver doesn't care what color you are or where you come from, he replied with a smile. It just cares if you're willing to work hard and take risks. That evening, as they sat in the boarding house's common room planning their next move, Emma noticed something that made her heart skip a beat. Across the room, sitting alone at a small table, was a girl who looked exactly like her. The girl was about Emma's age, with the same blonde hair and blue eyes, the same stubborn chin and determined expression. Around her neck was a turquoise necklace identical to Emma's, and she was reading a book with the focused intensity of someone who had taught herself to be self-reliant. "Papa," Emma whispered, tugging on Morrison's sleeve. "Look at that girl over there." Morrison followed her gaze and felt his breath catch in his throat. The resemblance was unmistakable. The girl looked like Emma's twin sister, Sarah. Dakota said suddenly, his voice filled with recognition. "Her name is Sarah. I've heard the Apache women talking about her. She's Mackenzie's adopted daughter." Emma's eyes widened with understanding. "That's my sister, isn't it? The other daughter of Mary Crow Feather?" Morrison studied the girl across the room, his mind racing through the implications. If she's Mackenzie's adopted daughter, then she's been raised by the man who killed your mother. She probably doesn't know the truth about who she really is. "We have to talk to her," Emma said, starting to rise from her chair. "Wait," Dakota said, grabbing her arm gently. "Look at how she's positioned. She's watching the room, checking the exits. She's not here by accident." Morrison's blood ran cold as he realized what Dakota was suggesting. "She's here to find us. Mackenzie sent her." "But she's just a child," Emma protested. "So are you," Morrison replied grimly. "And look what you've been able to do. Mackenzie has been training her just like he trained you to be a weapon." Emma looked at her sister with new eyes, seeing the careful way she held herself up, the way her hand stayed close to something concealed beneath her dress. Sarah wasn't just a lost little girl, she was a predator, and they were her prey. "I have to try," Emma said. "She's my sister. She deserves to know the truth." Before Morrison or Dakota could stop her, Emma walked across the room and sat down at Sarah's table. The other girl looked up from her book, her blue eyes cold and calculating. "Hello," Emma said simply. "My name is Emma Morrison. I think we need to talk." Sarah's hand moved slightly toward her concealed weapon. "I don't know who you are, but you're making a mistake. I'm your sister," Emma said, pulling her turquoise necklace from beneath her dress. "Look at this. It's exactly like yours." For a moment, something flickered in Sarah's eyes, surprise, recognition, or maybe just confusion. But then her expression hardened again. "I don't have a sister," she said coldly. "I don't have any family except Colonel McKenzie." "That's not true," Emma said, her voice filled with gentle insistence. "We were both born to the same mother, Mary Crow Feather. We were separated when we were babies, but we're still family." Sarah's laugh was bitter and harsh. "Mary Crow Feather was an Apache savage who died in a raid on Fort Huachuca. I have nothing to do with her or her people. She wasn't a savage," Emma said, her voice growing stronger. "She was our mother, and she loved us. She made these necklaces for us, so we would always remember that we belonged to each other." Sarah looked at the turquoise stones around Emma's neck, and for a moment, her composure cracked. "Where did you get that?" "From our mother before she died. Just like you got yours from her." Emma leaned forward, her voice urgent. "Sarah, I know this is hard to believe, but Colonel McKenzie has been lying to you. He's the one who killed our mother. He's the one who separated us." "You're lying," Sarah said, but her voice lacked conviction. "I have proof," Emma said, pulling out one of the documents they had found in the mine. "Read this. It's in Mackenzie's own handwriting." Sarah took the document with trembling hands, her eyes scanning the pages. As she read, her face grew pale and her breathing became shallow. "This can't be true," she whispered. "This can't be real." "It's real," Emma said gently. "And it's not your fault. You were just a baby when he took you. You didn't know what he was doing." Sarah looked up from the document, her eyes now filled with tears. "If this is true, then everything I've believed, everything I've done, can be forgiven," Emma said, reaching across the table to take her sister's hand. "You're my family, and family forgives each other." For a moment, the two sisters sat in silence, seeing themselves reflected in each other's eyes. The resemblance was unmistakable, not just in their physical appearance, but in their intelligence, in their courage, and their capacity for love. "I remember you," Sarah said suddenly, her voice filled with wonder. "I remember playing with you, singing with you. I remember feeling like half of me was missing." Emma squeezed her sister's hand. "I remember too. I remember how you always tried to make me laugh when I was sad, and how you would share your food with me even when you were hungry." Their reunion was interrupted by the sound of approaching horses. Through the window, they could see cavalry soldiers surrounding the boarding house. Mackenzie had found them, and he had come in force. "He's here," Sarah said, her voice filled with terror. "He's come to take me back." "No," Emma said firmly. "We're not going back. We're going to tell everyone the truth." Morrison and Dakota rushed to their table, weapons ready. "There are at least 20 soldiers out there," Morrison said. "Too many to fight. Then we don't fight." Emma said, her young mind working quickly. "We do what we did at the mine. We tell the truth to everyone who will listen." She stood up and walked to the center of the common room, her small voice carrying clearly in the suddenly quiet space. "Listen to me, everyone. I have something important to tell you." The miners, gamblers, and travelers in the room turned to look at the small girl who had suddenly commanded their attention. Emma held up the documents they had found, her voice growing stronger with each word. "My name is Emma Morrison, and this is my sister Sarah. We are the daughters of an Apache woman named Mary Crow Feather, who was murdered by Colonel McKenzie of the United States Army." Murmurs rippled through the crowd. This was not what they had expected to hear from a 6-year-old girl. "Colonel McKenzie has been staging fake Apache raids for years," Emma continued. "He's been killing innocent people and blaming the Apache for his crimes. He's been using children like us as weapons in his private war." She held up the documents, making sure everyone could see them. "I have proof. I have Colonel McKenzie's own orders, his payment records, his instructions for how to stage convincing Indian attacks." The crowd was completely silent now, hanging on every word. Through the windows, they could see Mackenzie's soldiers taking positions around the building, but they couldn't act without confirming everything Emma was saying. "My sister and I were separated as babies," Emma continued. "I was raised by white families who didn't know the truth about my heritage. Sarah was raised by Colonel McKenzie himself, trained to hunt and kill Apache people without knowing that our own mother was Apache." Sarah stood up beside her sister, her voice shaky but determined. "It's true. Everything she's saying is true. I've been living with a man who killed our mother, calling him father, doing his work without knowing what he really was." The crowd erupted in angry shouts and curses. These were people who had lost friends and family members to the Apache wars, and they were learning that those deaths had been orchestrated by a corrupt military officer. "Where is this Mackenzie?" someone shouted. Emma pointed toward the window. "He's outside with his soldiers. He came here to kill us to keep the truth from coming out." The miners began to arm themselves, their faces set with grim determination. They had been lied to, manipulated, and used, and they were not going to let it continue. "We want to see this proof." Klaus Müller called out, his German accent thick with emotion. Emma handed him the documents, and he read them aloud to the crowd. As Muller's voice carried Mackenzie's own words across the room, the crowd's anger grew stronger. These are the words of Colonel McKenzie himself. Mueller said, his voice shaking with rage. Written in his own hand, describing how he has been murdering innocent people and blaming the Apache for his crimes. The crowd began to move toward the doors, ready to confront McKenzie and his soldiers. But Emma held up her hand, stopping them. "Wait," she said. "There's something else you need to know. Colonel McKenzie isn't working alone. He has associates throughout the territorial government. If you kill him, the others will just cover up his crimes and continue the conspiracy." "Then what do you suggest?" someone called out. Emma looked at her sister, then at Morrison and Dakota. "We need to get to the territorial capital. We need to make sure these documents reach the governor and the territorial legislature. We need to make sure the whole truth comes out." The crowd murmured approval, but they also understood the challenge. Mackenzie's soldiers were outside, and the road to Prescott was dangerous under the best of circumstances. "We'll help you," Mueller said, speaking for the crowd. "Jerome doesn't bow to corrupt army officers. We'll get you to Prescott safely." Over the next hour, the miners organized themselves into an impromptu militia. They had weapons, horses, and most importantly, they had righteous anger on their side. Mackenzie's 20 soldiers were outnumbered 3-1 by armed miners who had nothing to lose. "Colonel McKenzie," Mueller called out from the boarding house porch, "we know who you are and what you've done. Come out and face justice." McKenzie appeared from behind his soldiers, his face twisted with rage and desperation. "Those children are dangerous fugitives. They've been poisoned by Apache lies." "We've seen the documents," another miner shouted. "We've seen your own handwriting. You're the liar here." Emma stepped out onto the porch, her small frame dwarfed by the armed men around her. "Colonel McKenzie," she called out, her voice carrying clearly in the mountain air. "I know you raised Sarah to be loyal to you, but she's not your daughter. She's my sister, and she deserves to know the truth about what you did to our mother." Mackenzie's face went pale as he saw Sarah standing beside Emma. "Sarah, come here immediately. These people are filling your head with lies." Sarah looked at the man who had raised her, the man she had called father for 6 years. "You killed my mother," she said simply. "You killed Mary Crowfeather, and you've been using me as a weapon ever since." "I saved you," Mackenzie shouted. "I gave you a home, a purpose, a chance to serve something greater than yourself." "You stole my childhood," Sarah replied. "You turned me into a killer without telling me why." The standoff continued for several tense minutes, with Mackenzie's soldiers facing off against the armed miners. But gradually, Mackenzie realized that he was outnumbered and outgunned. His men were looking increasingly uncomfortable as they understood the full scope of their colonel's crimes. "Stand down, men," Mackenzie ordered finally. "We're withdrawing." "No, you're not," Emma said, stepping forward. "You're coming with us to Prescott. You're going to face justice for what you've done." Mackenzie's hand moved to his sidearm, but before he could draw it, one of his own soldiers stepped forward. "Colonel, sir," the young lieutenant said, his voice shaking, "I can't follow these orders anymore. If what these documents say is true, then we've been participating in murder." Other soldiers began to step forward, laying down their weapons and refusing to follow Mackenzie's orders. The conspiracy was falling apart as the truth spread through the ranks. Mackenzie looked around at his rebellious soldiers, the angry miners, and the 2 little girls who had brought his world crashing down. "You don't understand," he said desperately. "Everything I did was for the greater good. The Apache wars had to continue. The territory needed to be pacified. The territory needed to be freed from people like you," Emma said simply. "People who profit from war and suffering." The journey to Prescott took 3 days, with Mackenzie under guard and his former soldiers serving as witnesses to his crimes. Emma and Sarah rode together, sharing stories and memories as they slowly rebuilt the bond that had been broken by years of separation. "I used to dream about you," Sarah said as they made camp on the second night. "I would dream about playing with another little girl who looked just like me. But Mackenzie always told me those were just fantasies." "They weren't fantasies," Emma replied. "They were memories. Even when we were apart, part of us remembered being together." Morrison and Dakota watched the reunion with a mixture of joy and sadness. They were happy that the girls had found each other, but they also knew that the process of healing would be long and difficult. "What happens now?" Dakota asked Morrison as they sat by the campfire. "Now we make sure the truth gets told," Morrison replied. "We make sure that Mackenzie and his associates pay for what they've done. And we try to build a better future for our daughters." "Our daughters," Dakota repeated, testing the words. "I like the sound of that." The territorial capital of Prescott was in chaos when their group arrived. Word of Mackenzie's conspiracy had spread like wildfire, and angry citizens were demanding answers from their government. Governor Anson Safford met them at the Capitol building, his face grim with the weight of the revelations. "These documents," he said, examining the evidence they had brought, "they detail a conspiracy that reaches into the highest levels of the territorial government." Emma sat in a chair that was too big for her, her small hands folded in her lap. Beside her, Sarah fidgeted nervously, still adjusting to the idea that she was no longer a weapon, but a witness to crimes. "How many people were involved?" the governor asked. "At least a dozen military officers," Morrison replied. "Plus civilian contractors, government officials, and businessmen who profited from the artificial war." "And the children?" Governor Safford asked, looking at Emma and Sarah. "Are there others like them?" Emma nodded. Mackenzie's journal mentions at least 30 children who were separated from their families and used as weapons or informants. Some were placed with white families, others with Apache families, all as part of his experiment. The governor's face grew even more serious. "We need to find these children and reunite them with their real families. But that's going to be complicated. Many of them have been living with their adoptive families for years. We can help," Sarah said, speaking up for the first time. "Emma and I understand what they've been through. We can help them remember who they really are." Over the following weeks, Emma and Sarah worked with territorial officials to identify and locate the children who had been caught up in Mackenzie's conspiracy. It was difficult work that required patience and sensitivity as they helped families navigate the complex process of reunion and healing. Some of the reunions were joyful with children and parents recognizing each other despite years of separation. Others were more difficult with children who had no memory of their original families or who had grown to love their adoptive families. Emma found herself serving as a translator and mediator, helping Apache families communicate with territorial officials and helping white families understand the pain that had been inflicted on Native communities. Her ability to speak both English and Apache, combined with her understanding of both cultures, made her an invaluable asset in the healing process. Sarah, meanwhile, worked with the territorial attorney general to build legal cases against the surviving conspirators. Her knowledge of Mackenzie's operations and her access to his private network made her a key witness in the prosecution of the men who had profited from the artificial war. The trials were lengthy and complex, with dozens of defendants and hundreds of witnesses. But gradually, the full scope of the conspiracy emerged. Military officers, government officials, and private contractors had all been involved in the scheme to stage fake Apache raids and profit from the resulting violence. Mackenzie himself was sentenced to death, but he died in prison before the sentence could be carried out. His co-conspirators received lengthy prison terms, and the territorial government was forced to pay substantial compensation to the victims of their crimes. But perhaps the most important outcome was the change in public opinion. The revelation that the Apache people had been innocent victims rather than savage aggressors forced the territory to confront its own prejudices and assumptions about race and justice. Emma stood before the territorial legislature 6 months after the conspiracy was exposed, her small figure commanding the attention of the assembled lawmakers. She wore a simple blue dress and both turquoise necklaces, her own, and one that had belonged to her mother. Honored representatives. She began, her voice clear and strong. I stand before you today, not as a victim, but as a bridge between two worlds. My sister and I have lived as both Apache and white, and we have learned that there is more that unites us than divides us. She spoke about the need for schools that would teach both Apache and white children together about the importance of preserving Apache culture and language, and about the necessity of building trust between communities that had been torn apart by lies and violence. The conspiracy that brought us here was built on the assumption that Apache people and white people could never live together in peace. She continued. But my sister and I are living proof that this assumption is wrong. We represent the possibility of a future where our peoples can coexist, learn from each other, and build something better than what came before. The legislature listened in respectful silence, many of them moved by the words of this remarkable child who had survived so much and emerged with such wisdom and compassion. When Emma finished speaking, the chamber erupted in applause. More importantly, the lawmakers voted unanimously to establish a commission for Apache white reconciliation with Emma and Sarah, serving as its youngest advisors. 1 year after the conspiracy was exposed, Emma and Sarah stood together on the site where their mother's village had once been. The Apache people had been granted the right to return to their ancestral lands, and they were rebuilding their communities with the help of territorial funding. A new school occupied the center of the settlement, its classrooms filled with children of all backgrounds learning together. The school bore a simple plaque that read, Mary Crow Feather School for Truth and Reconciliation. Dakota joined them at the edge of the settlement, his weathered face showing the peace that had come with the end of the artificial war. Your mother would be proud, he said quietly. She always believed that her daughters would bring healing to our peoples. Emma nodded, her hand touching both turquoise necklaces. I can feel her sometimes, you know. When I'm helping families reunite, or when I'm translating between languages, or when I'm helping people understand each other. I can feel her presence. Sarah smiled at her sister. I feel it too. It's like she's still with us, still protecting us. Morrison approached from the school, his face bright with the satisfaction of work well done. The last group of children has been reunited with their families, he said. 37 children in total, all of them now safely home where they belong. Emma felt a deep sense of satisfaction. This was what she had been born to do, to help heal the wounds that had been inflicted by hatred and lies, to serve as a bridge between worlds that had been artificially divided. What happens now? Sarah asked. Now we keep building, Emma replied. One family at a time, one truth at a time, one bridge at a time. As the sun set over the rebuilt settlement, Emma and Sarah stood with their two fathers watching Apache children and white children play together in the dusty streets. The sound of their laughter echoed off the adobe buildings, a testament to the healing that had begun. The conspiracy that had torn apart so many lives was finally over. The truth had been told, justice had been served, and the healing had begun. Emma and Sarah Morrison, the daughters of two worlds, had found their place in the universe, and it was exactly where they belonged. The two girls who had bridged two worlds had become the women who would help build a better future for all children, regardless of their heritage or their past. The truth had set them all free, and in that freedom, they had found the possibility of peace. Their story was complete, but their legacy would continue for generations to come. Emma and Sarah had learned that the most important battles are not fought with weapons, but with courage, truth, and love. And those were battles that could never be lost, as long as there were people willing to fight for them. As the stars emerged in the darkening sky, Emma Morrison, little star, looked up at the heavens and smiled. Her mother's spirit was at peace, her sister was by her side, and the future was bright with possibility. The orphan girls who had stood alone in the wreckage of their broken world had become the bridge that connected two peoples, and in that connection they had found their home at last.